Thanks again to Mike for his time and for coming and sharing some of the details about Hawaii within the inventory that's being conducted or that's been conducted. So right now we're basically trying to tell a story. And the first portion that I mentioned was primarily about the context, what greenhouse gases are, giving these concepts. So some of those concepts will continually be used. I want to continue that story into talking about offsets more specifically. And as we do talk about those things, we're going to introduce concepts to you. We also are aware that some people, again, are going to be coming in and out throughout the day. But basically, the intention is to introduce those concepts and then put those into practice to draw an understanding of what offsets are, the usefulness of them, and then some potential downfalls within that tool. So this portion is about what offsets are. And to begin to understand what offsets are, and also to get at that greenhouse gas emissions inventory and to get towards those reductions, we need actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These actions can come in the form of renewable energy. They can come in the form of converting the transportation sector into a low-carbon transportation source. They can come in the form of sequestration through land use change. There are a plethora of greenhouse gas emissions reductions at hand that are available to start to get towards the reductions necessary to get the inventory down to the necessary levels. Outside of what Mike had presented, Hawaii is taking numerous actions. This slide is very dense. It is not meant to be read right now, but it's mainly meant to be stated how much the state of Hawaii is doing. So within the renewable portfolio standard, energy efficiency standards, building codes, the commitment to go carbon neutral, Hawaii is doing a lot towards greenhouse gas reduction actions. But basically, the point here is that greenhouse gas reduction actions are not synonymous with offsets. So with that statement, and also going forward, I want to point you to, we gave you a list of key terms that you would have gotten as you came in. And these are terms that we will be using throughout the day. The area of climate change, of sustainability, of greenhouse gas emissions, uses a terminology, a language set that's somewhat squishy at times. Sometimes folks refer to one thing and mean another. Sometimes they refer to a definition of something, and they're not incorrect, they're just using it differently than other folks. And so we want to basically put forward the definitions that we have in that packet for you, not as what we are saying is the universal truth of always this will be used this way. These are an accurate way to use these terms. Some folks might use these terms a little bit differently. We're okay with that. You should be okay with that. But we ask that in the room today. We talk about these terms in the way that they're laid out there. And one of the major terms here that we need to focus on is offsets. So offsets can colloquially be used much more informally. And in this sense, it's mostly used as a verb. So potentially someone might say, I was offsetting my carbon emissions today because I walked to the symposium rather than drove my car. There's not a problem using offset in this way, but today we want to talk about offset in a more formal capacity. We want to talk about offsets in the accredited, very specific form of what offsets can be, and this is the reason why. So in Act 16, among other things, it posits other states and private industries have established these types of credits for purchase by polluters to offset their carbon. And it's this purchase bit that's incredibly important. It's this purchase bit that requires us to talk about offsets in a formal capacity, because you cannot legitimately start to commoditize something unless you formalize it and certify it. So in order to purchase offsets, they must be formal, and so we need to talk about offsets formally. So when we're referring to offsets, we're referring to something very specific. And I want to point to the definition that we'll be using today. An offset credit, sometimes referred to as greenhouse gas emissions reduction credits, or offset certificate, or offset instrument, or carbon offset, or greenhouse gas offset, or simply offset, is a credit for mitigating 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent by paying someone else to avoid 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent elsewhere. Offset credits are monetarily tradable, as well as evaluated, certified, and guaranteed by a standard or a program. So there's a lot to unpack there. I will do that going forward right now. But one of the things that I want to make sure is really clear, and I'll repeat this a few times and I said up front, but greenhouse gas reductions and offsets are not the same thing. They are not equivalent. Sequestration is not equivalent to an offset. Offsets are a tool or a mechanism that helps to implement certain types of greenhouse gas reductions. And so it's this tool, mechanism, credit that we're referring to when we refer to offsets. So what's the purpose of offsets? So the primary purpose of offsets is to bridge the gap between low and high cost greenhouse gas reductions. So the gap in the cost of greenhouse gas reductions could be attributed to numerous things. It could be attributed to the fact that you may be located in one of the wealthiest locations on the planet, and someone else is located in a less wealthy location. It could be attributed to the fact that you work in an industry or a technology that is more difficult to reduce emissions, and someone works in one that is less difficult to reduce emissions. And the main intention is that you find the lowest cost carbon reductions. This is the intention of offsets. So with this intention, we also get some benefits. So one of the things that we get if offsets are used effectively is market efficiencies. So that's the trading portion of them. We can also get technology transfers. This would more likely than not come between developing or developed groups and regions. We can support developing regions by sending funding that direction, or technologies that direction. And if the offset is produced at a local location, you can, but do not necessarily receive, air quality or ecosystem services. So air quality and ecosystem services attributed to offsets are very dependent on the type of greenhouse gas reduction that is converted to an offset credit. You'll hear about various greenhouse gas reduction projects later in the day. Some things like forestry do offer these ecosystem services without a doubt. You'll hear about that from that group, the ecosystem services provided. Some other types of offsets that will not be presented later, but that do get produced, is when you destroy higher global warming potential gases. When you do this, you're not necessarily improving anything, but you're basically taking that thousands of tons carbon equivalent and bringing it down to 1 or nothing. And so when you do that, you get the greenhouse gas reduction, but there wasn't an air quality benefit to be achieved or an ecosystem service, and this is okay. I want to make sure to be clear, this is okay. As long as you're getting these other market efficiencies that are associated with it. So I also, very similarly to the way I talked about scopes, I want to talk about a few other types of environmental credits that are very closely linked and related to offsets. So emissions reduction credits, these sometimes go by various names, but they're usually a type of emissions reduction credit not associated with greenhouse gases or CO2, but instead associated with other criteria and local pollutants. So local regulatory agencies may issue these types of credits in order to keep emissions down in their region. And these are always associated very specifically with a type of pollutant. So you might have a NOx emissions reduction credit, you might have a VOC emissions reduction credit, but these are distinctly different than an offset credit. You also have renewable energy credits, which are basically a credit that are very similar to offsets. You're trying to take something intangible, like greenhouse gas emissions, you can't see it, and put it in a credit that allows people to get market efficiencies and trade those things around. In this case, you're talking about renewable energy. The kilowatt does not care where it came from. But this renewable energy credit is intended to tell you that. So it's used as an instrument to allow those things to be traded. So the reason I bring this up, there are many other types of environmental credits. The reason I bring this up is very similar to the reason I brought up scopes, is to sort of take this off the table. We're not talking about these things today. We're talking about offsets, very specifically for some of the reasons I've previously stated. So our ultimate goal with what we're working on as AECOM is to go through an offset program feasibility and talk about the mechanics required to establish an offset program. And today, the primary thing that we're going to be doing is going through a program feasibility, through developing an understanding of offset projects themselves. You can't really have a program unless you have projects to put in that program. And so as a first step, this is the major part of the day, talking about and understanding the projects. So, in order to do that, and these are some concepts that will be used over and over again throughout the day, but we're basically looking at project feasibility, the ability to convert a greenhouse gas emissions reduction to an offset. There are essentially 4 steps. 1 is quality criteria. 2 is something called additionality. 3, talking about financial viability. And 4, talking about environmental justice. Right now, the presentation that you are currently listening to from me is intended to cover these first 2 bullets in depth. Steve Basco will be coming up after the break later on to talk about markets and financials related, and we'll later have a presentation from Dr. Watson on environmental justice as it relates to converting greenhouse gas emissions reductions into offsets. So again, or I guess this isn't again, but I've mentioned that GHGs aren't reductions, but most greenhouse gas reductions are not converted to offsets. Offsets are a very specialized tool. If you think that offsets are a problem, it's probably because that tool may have been misused. If you think offsets are the end result, I'm mostly here to encourage you to really care about greenhouse gas emissions reductions and view offsets as a tool and get excited about offsets about as much as you would get excited about any tool for the usefulness of that tool. So, quality criteria is that first bullet. There are generally 5 quality criteria. There's real, quantifiable, permanent, enforceable, and verifiable. Sometimes this quality criteria gets mixed up. Sometimes things are combined. Sometimes things are added. These are the general quality criteria that we'll be talking about to understand them. So what do we mean by each one of these? Pointer, go. Nope. I'm trying to get to the next slide. We're back. What a disruption. Thank you for your patience through that harrowing moment. Okay, so real. What do we mean by this? Basically, the initial question, what is it in your action or project that is reducing greenhouse gases? If you're a truck driver and you come and say, I would like to produce offsets, that's not enough information to establish a reduction is real. You have to do something. You have to know what the reduction is. If you have an empty lot and you build the most energy efficient building that you can think of on that lot, but it still consumes energy from fossil fuels at some marginal rate, that's a great thing, but you've taken zero space and now increased emissions. This is not a reduction. If you have a building that exists and you retrofit this building to be more energy efficient, Now we're talking about real reductions. That's what we mean by real. And this is, again, the very first step in getting through this whole process. You also have to quantify those emissions. They have to be quantifiable. Somewhat is deceptively challenging, somewhat deceptively simple. Some things, for example, if you're talking about energy efficiency, are a little bit more straightforward because we have emissions factors and other methods that we can start to get at efficiency in a calculatable way. Other things like land use change become a little bit more complicated. It's still possible. You can quantify these things. It's just a more complicated process. If you're talking about destroying high global warming potential gases, again, quantification is pretty straightforward. You take the global warming potential and bring it down. So quantification is a step that needs to go through. Permanence. Permanence is pretty much an issue when you're dealing with land use change. If you're destroying gases, you've destroyed them, they're gone, you're done. If you required infrastructure to destroy them, that's okay. The gas you destroyed is still gone. So your permanence is fine. But if you change the land, you might encounter things like forest fires. You might encounter erosion, taking away your land where you just changed it to reduce emissions. You might encounter an invasive species that comes in and destroys whatever sequestration that you have. You might also want to use the land for something else at a different time. And so permanence in land use change is something that needs to be overcome and understood. But permanence is on that criteria list. Enforceability. Enforceability comes in multiple forms. One of those forms is through compliance. There are not many compliance regimes that give this enforceability. When there isn't one, the enforceability is achieved through what are sometimes called third-party watchdogs. Enforceability can also be achieved through financial mechanisms like insurance policies. So whatever the emissions reduction that you have, again, if you want to convert it to a credit, you need to get through this phase. And finally, verification. So all the things that have been mentioned before, and a couple things that will be mentioned in a moment, require verification. So what this means is there are people, real people, on the ground, looking at your data, taking measurements, making sure that what you said is true. So these 5 are the quality criteria that we're defining and going to be dealing with. Additionality is another one of the steps that we need to go through in our journey to convert greenhouse gas emissions reductions into that purchasable, tradable offset credit. If you're familiar with offsets, you may see additionality included in the quality criteria many times. That's okay. We've pulled it out separately due to its sheer importance. The very simple way to look at additionality is that your emissions reduction would not have occurred otherwise if it weren't for the creation of your offset credit. So there are 2 primary tests that are used to distinguish and decide whether your emissions reduction is in fact additional. The first is a legal test. If you are required to, by law, take that action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, your greenhouse gas emissions reduction is not additional, is not eligible for creation of offset credits. If also, you need to pass this performance test. So if you create an emissions reduction and it would have happened otherwise, maybe you already planned on doing it and now you just want to get paid for it after the fact, that wouldn't be additional. Another thing that's related to additionality is something called leakage. So basically, within that performance test, if you take an action to reduce greenhouse gases where you are located and greenhouse gas emissions increase somewhere else because change in supply or demand, whatever it is related to your greenhouse gas emissions reduction, your project is not additional. Additionality is an incredibly complicated thing to review. The verifier mentioned before does review this. Other agencies review this. There's some debate within additionality. But additionality is a major gate that needs to be passed to convert those GHG emissions reductions into offset credits. So how do we know whether quality criteria or additionality are met outside of the guy in front of the room telling you about them? We have standards, protocols, and registries that really help to sum up this process. So the major standards in the world are listed here. We have some international standards and something commonly referred to as the CDM, or the Clean Development Mechanism. We have RED, which is basically forestry related. A note about RED is not always offsets. Sometimes RED, there's no credit made, there's a fund produced to just pay for the project. So RED has many components. One of those components is in fact offsets. You have joint implementation, which will basically say if you are not signed on to the Kyoto Protocol, this doesn't matter for you. Only those signed there work in this space. You have state-level offset programs. Some of these, and particularly the markets related to these, Steve Basco is going to go over a bit, so I'm only talking about the standards and getting into the quality of these offset credits. But at the state level, you have an offset program in California. You have RGGI, it's a group of states on the east coast of the US. These programs have offsets as a small component of a regulated market. So Steve's going to get into some of the details about that and how it relates to the rest of those programs. You also then have the voluntary market, which is one of the most popular markets spoken about in terms of offsets. And you have 4 primary programs or standards in that market: the American Carbon Registry, the Climate Action Reserve, Verified Carbon Standard, also sometimes referred to as VERA at this point, and you have the Gold Standard. All of these work within a voluntary space, producing these credits. So how do these programs produce these credits? Not dissimilarly to producing a greenhouse gas inventory, they use protocols and methodologies. So basically a protocol or a methodology to produce these credits is a manual or a handbook or a roadmap or instructions on how to take what would be referred to as your real, quantifiable emissions reduction, put it through a verification phase, determine additionality. The protocols do all of these things, and they're all specifically written to a specific type of greenhouse gas reduction project. There are hundreds of protocols. The CDM may have the most. The general categories where these protocols exist are on this table here, listed on the right, from renewable energy to transportation to land use change and livestock management. These are general categories. The GHG reduction action would need to be more specific into individual protocols. As I mentioned, there are many, but we don't have a place to list them all, so we've summed them into categories to show the general types of reduction areas where offsets can be generated. There are also many locations that these are run. Typically, with energy credits, these are only in developing countries. This is mostly due to not being able to pass that legal additionality test in states and countries where there's renewable energy requirements. And also within these sectors, when you're dealing with offsets, you're also then helping out with that technology transfer that I had mentioned before. So protocols are the methods that are used by the standards to guarantee quality and additionality. Then you need to track these things, and these are done through registries. The registries are kind of an inside the baseball look at offsets. there are two primary registries, APX and IHS market, previously just referred to as market. These are basically locations where offsets are tracked to ensure singular ownership of the credit and make sure that we're not double counting these credits. After all, people are paying real money for the credit that is produced by actions that are taken, so we want to guarantee it. So all of the standards essentially use these two registries behind the scenes to track the credits as they're produced. And finally, basically, to sum up how all of that comes together in a very basic process. Steve's going to get into some details about these things later on, but essentially you have 5 basic steps when you're looking to take your greenhouse gas emissions reduction and convert it to an offset. Your first step is to select a protocol. If one doesn't exist, you can develop one. It would be a lie to say you cannot, but it is not an easy process. It is very time-consuming and expensive, and even once you have a protocol, you still need to get through more steps. Then you develop the project. This is where you basically build your infrastructure or change your land. This is the development of that real greenhouse gas emissions reduction project phase. Then you have the management, monitoring, and verification. So this is a lot of where the calculation comes into play, the quantification, continually monitor these components. So that way we can say these emissions reductions were achieved. We can have it ready for a verifier who can then send it to a standard or program and then trade them. So step 4 is getting them to the registry, so those behind the scenes, making sure that they're individually counted only once. And finally, on to the consumer, or in some cases, if new government programs are put forward, you can get them within the government programs. Start to trade them. So these are the basic steps. And basically, that is the morning session. How are we doing on time, Aaron? Far ahead. So we were going to take a break, but we can do a little bit of question and answer if you guys would like up front. I will note that the details of the markets and financials will be talked about by Steve after the break. So if you have questions about that, I'd encourage you to hold those. But if you do have questions about what I have already said, I'm happy to take those questions. And I'll also note that all of these concepts, again, are going to be reintroduced in the context of Hawaii-specific projects. So we can talk through this live. We have a tool that you'll be able to use. So, yeah, and Aaron's going to say something first.
Cool. So I just wanted to kind of check in terms of schedule. So what we were hoping was that if we did run ahead of schedule, we'd be able to use that extra time for Q&A, like Michael said. But I also just wanted to provide a little bit of context. These themes that he's presenting today are very complex, and we could have filled a 3-day symposium on it. So the intention of the morning session was just kind of introducing the vocabulary, setting up some of the basic terminology and some of the basic concepts. But in terms of understanding everything he presented today, our afternoon session and having an actual examples to run through and giving you guys a chance to kind of practice and apply the decision criteria, that's what we're gonna do in the afternoon. So if any of you are feeling like you don't understand how this works yet, stay with us. Don't worry, it's coming. But so the point of this morning is to kind of set up the building blocks, introduce the concepts, and then in terms of running ahead of schedule, several people that RSVP'd said that they'd be coming for the morning session or the afternoon session. So rather than sliding the agenda up, we'll just make the Q&A longer, make the breaks longer, so that way anybody that was coming for a dedicated session and really wanted to come for the 1 o'clock hour, they'll be here and they won't miss any of the content. So with that, we have a microphone set up here on the right. If anybody'd like to come up and ask any questions, Michael's available for any Q&A, and otherwise, we can go ahead and break, and then we'll resume with Steve Bethko. Anybody have any questions?
Oh, would you mind going to the, I guess you can yell from there. I'm fine with that. You fine?
It's a short question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the relationship between clean development mechanisms, joint implementation, and other UN initiatives,
Sure.
and how they relate to different standards and emission trading. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so the Clean Development Mechanism was created through the UN to basically take this idea of offsets. The intention is really in the name there, Clean Development Mechanism. The intention was to essentially look to more developing countries and nations and offer them a way to get funding, technology transfers through offsets by those developed nations. So it was partly created for that specific exchange. Joint implementation was more a mechanic between those signed on to Kyoto Protocol to trade the emissions within those entities and states that were signed up to that protocol. So as a group of states, they could reduce their emissions together. So that's kind of how those both work in short, and the difference between them. They were essentially, as far as greenhouse gas offsets, the first offset programs. And RED is also, you said all UN programs, so I'll mention RED. RED is also a part of that, a reduction in emissions through deforestation and forest degradation was its initial acronym. They've added on reforestation, afforestation, sustainable forestation. So there's many components of RED at this point, and it's basically just referred to as RED Plus without the acronym. That was intended essentially to send funding to nations where deforestation was a massive issue and preserve those lands to keep the carbon sequestered there, sequestered. When that was happening initially, deforestation and forest degradation accounted for about 17% of global emissions. And so it was a strongly supported initiative for both conservation measures as well as CO2 reduction measures. So, yeah. Yes, sir, back there.
Yeah, real quick. So I'm trying to get a better understanding of what a protocol is. So is a protocol under any of those program categories, is that like a suite of activities? So for example, in a forestry protocol, would that look like a list of species that are appropriate, a harvest horizon?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, what is that? Is it a suite of activities essentially?
Yeah, great question. Yes, a protocol is specific activities, specific instructions, very detailed. Forestry is one of the more complicated sets of protocols. There are many types of forestry protocols, and they basically, depending on the type of protocol, lay out different parameters that need to be followed to get a credit under that specific protocol. So there are numerous protocols under forestry. Yeah, there's protocols specifically, say, for urban forestry. Those protocols, to date, some of them are in California, have not been used. It turns out under urban forestry, it's very difficult to quantify at a cost-effective rate the amount of carbon sequestered in an urban forest and then create a credit. With that, I also do want to note and make sure to be very clear, the greenhouse gas reduction portion of it is very important, and it's something that should be done. And if offsets aren't the right tool to implement something, so urban forestry is a great example. It's very difficult for urban forestry, but doing urban forestry is a phenomenal thing to do. It does reduce emissions. There's other benefits to urban forestry. Talk to city planners and managers, and they'll always say, oh, everybody loves trees. Yeah, let's plant them. It's very expensive. So per carbon cost, it's very expensive. But you get these other benefits. There's studies saying people feel good around trees and nature. So it's an important thing. Yeah. Any other questions? I saw a couple. Yeah, yes.
One, I'd just like to follow up on what you just said about a social benefit, which
Mm-hmm.
I think when you went through the benefits many other ways in which people around the world have benefited from offset projects in ways that the planners sometimes don't foresee. So I just wanted to highlight that. Two, I have a question about this additionality aspect of the legal requirement. Does this mean that when a government somehow puts more legislation around environmental quality, that it could potentially remove that from the possibility of being an offset provision?
Yeah, great. Thank you for your comment. I agree, social benefit is very important, particularly as it relates to greenhouse gas reductions, and offsets can bring that. And to your question about additionality and governments, essentially I really want to highlight that within the context that was put forward, climate change and the goal to get the emissions inventory down, the primary focus should be on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And so certainly if the government passes legislation, you might remove portions of offsets from the toolkit available to get those emissions reductions implemented, but there might be a more effective tool to use to get those emissions reductions done. So there shouldn't be a fear about not having offsets. There should be a fear of not doing the greenhouse gas emissions reduction effort. And so when thinking about offsets and additionality and thinking about laws that are passed that might make an offset project no longer additional, if that law is more effective, then it's a better thing. It might not be more effective, and the details between these and looking at each individual GHG reduction action on its merits is really the important thing to focus on. So I really want to emphasize that everybody that is very excited about offsets should be very excited about greenhouse gas emissions reductions and should look at offsets very specifically as one tool that allows for that implementation. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I think it ignores the incentive aspect of the offset to a certain group of people. It's very attractive to have an offset.
Yes, offset.
It will not be provided by a legislation.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I also think that offsets are very attractive to folks. They think about offsets as this is where we'll make money to do greenhouse gas reductions. Steve's going to talk about some financials and markets about that, and so he'll get to your question a little bit more. We also have planned some flexibility throughout the day, so as he goes through his pieces, as we run our tool, go through these concepts more, we'll continue to unpack your question. But yeah, I definitely hear that that's a concern, and certainly, you want to make sure to incentivize these things in the most economically way possible. So yeah.
Passing a new law reduces the value of existing offsets or can displace them, correct?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And basically, once an offset credit is created, with the exception of some complexities that are about land use change, but the credit, once created, the emissions is established as being reduced, and that credit is not necessarily devalued unless the marketplace devalues it. So it depends on whether or not the market shifts its demands about within those offsets. But one example of this that kind of gets to your point is landfill gas projects, where destruction of landfill gas was a big form of offset credits generated in the early 2000s. Essentially what these projects was going around capturing the gas from the landfill and then destroying it, either through a flare or energy generation. Different economic incentives would encourage one or the other, but basically through that you take the methane, which is approximately 24, 25 times global warming potential of CO2, and you destroy it. So for every ton you destroy, you get 20 tons of credits. And landfill generation credits were a dominant, like I said, dominant force, but then regulations were passed by the government requiring the capture of these gases. So prior to the regulations, you had economic incentives, But you didn't have all landfill gases trapping their gases and doing it. You had some that felt that they wanted to, but not all. So when the government regulation came in and said at the federal level and essentially started to put caps on these landfills, then all of them were required to do it. All of the credits that were generated prior to the law are still valid, are still very real reductions that were certified, they're still tradable, they still exist. And this is a good thing. Those were early actors. But all of those projects that were underway, again, the exciting thing, the greenhouse gas reduction that they were producing continues to produce. But now that everybody is required to do it, they no longer get that incentive that they did as early actors. And so that's a little bit, I think, of an example that gets at your question of how does it interact between the actions and the incentives of actions and then government interaction. And that's one case of how that worked out. Yeah. Any other questions?
I go and ask if you can just kind of reiterate the distinctions between offsets and reductions and why an offset isn't a reduction and why they're interchangeable.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think that there's a lot of confusion around this topic. And I blame nobody for this confusion because if you are not working in this space and living and breathing this space and you Google some stuff, they seem like they're interchangeable. If you spend a little bit of time on the internet, they seem like they're interchangeable. The reason they seem like they're interchangeable is because the terms are often used interchangeably, but the offset is a credit. It's conversion of that greenhouse gas emissions reduction into a credit that can get to the market where people can trade it. So that's the difference. The GHG emissions reduction, again, is the thing that everybody should be excited about. And the offset is a way to monetize that reduction so that way folks can take it and get money for their action. And that's what the offset is. I think I mentioned before that I wasn't going to talk about it again, but if you are familiar with renewable energy credits, they work very similarly. They are a monetized version to essentially label a kilowatt as being from a renewable source. If you looked at the kilowatt, you wouldn't have any idea it's just a kilowatt. But in order to provide some market interactions to get towards renewable energy, you basically take that kilowatt and turn it into something that we can call a credit and allows it to be traded. So in the same thing that a renewable kilowatt is not equivalent to a renewable energy credit, a greenhouse gas reduction is not equivalent to an offset. They're instruments to help implement the thing that we should all care about. And a valuable instrument, to be clear. You got a question? No? Great. Well, thank you so much for listening. And Steve Basco will be on. He'll get into some of the financials that are associated with this, get into some of the other details that are associated with offsets. And then we'll basically continue with these concepts and put them in action, talking about real greenhouse gas reductions in Hawaii and some groups that are doing some really great things towards greenhouse gas reduction. So thank you.